Alright, today's video is on the Aztecs who lived in central Mexico. The Aztecs came from the Toltec and Teotihuacan people who settled in the mountain basins of central Mexico. Teotihuacan, the city, began in early CE, between 0 and 100 CE, and by the 500, so within 500 years, 200,000 people were living in the city of Teotihuacan, which, if you check out this map, is actually right here in the center of the urban area of the Toltec civilization. They are famous for trading in obsidian, which is volcanic glass. It's when the dirt gets heated up from the magma and turns it into glass. It's very, very durable, but it's also very, very sharp. So it makes, like, this is an arrowhead that you could make it out of if you could carve it in. But it is glass, so it does shatter if you sort of drop it. Teotihuacan, the city, actually becomes abandoned in 750. And again, we're not quite sure why that happened. So the Toltecs, as a population, rise to power in 900 and hold that power for 3 centuries. They are exceptionally warlike. They maintained their power using their vast army and just conquering other groups and enslaving the people who were coming against them. They also use a lot of human sacrifices in order to keep their war god happy. So a lot of the people who would have lost in battles against the Toltecs, they would capture then a town and sacrifice even entire villages to their war god. One ruler, poor guy, he wanted to end human sacrifices and switch from honoring the war god to honoring Quetzalcoatl, who was known as the feathered serpent, but he was much, much more peaceful and pacifist as a god. And when he suggested this to the Toltec people, they exiled him and kicked him out of their country. So they were very proud of their human sacrifices. The Aztecs come out of this same system, but they take over from the Toltecs. And they begin as soldiers, again, very strong, very militaristic system. According to legend, their major city, Tenochtitlan, was built because of a god leading the early Aztecs to this location. In 1428, they create an alliance between themselves and 2 other city-states, and within the next couple of decades, using that military alliance, are able to control somewhere between 5 and 15 million people. This is an enormous empire that has a lot of power. They would do several things. I mean, they would conquer people and they would execute some. They would sacrifice some. But they would also leave some in place, and they had to pay tribute. They had to pay taxes to the Aztec emperor, similar to how the Mongols forced the Russians to pay taxes and pay tribute for essentially the security of not being attacked. So they have an absolute emperor, they have an absolute king who leads the entire nation. Then their next class had the military leaders along with the government officials and the priests. These people have massive amounts of land, massive amounts of wealth. These are super, super wealthy upper classes. Then in the middle you have the merchants, the artisans, the merchants, the artisans, the soldiers, and the farmers. And then, of course, at the bottom are slaves. Most of the slaves would have been conquered people. Tenochtitlan, the city, the major capital of the Aztec Empire, is built on a lake, which sounds insane, but they actually create little islands within the lake called chinampas, which were used to grow crops. So it's sort of like Venice, like you would use the boats and things like that in order to get to it. But it was very elaborate. It had palaces and temples, and it was just, it's amazing, this size and the scope of this city built completely on a lake. And this actual image takes us to a, well, yes, I want to allow it, takes us to a depiction of those champanas. So, chinampas. When you click on it, it shows you that they wove reeds together in order to hold in the dirt. And then they just piled up the plants over and over and over again to build the layers. And then took mud and stacked it on top of the layer of the plants and the reeds. And they grew trees to keep it from eroding, which is just absolutely crazy. So here's a list of some of the important crops that they grew, but again, it's a lot of the things that you think of for Thanksgiving and for typical Mexican meals. So if I go back, that takes us to their religion. They have thousands of gods. They weren't just Aztec gods, they had Toltec gods, and as they would take over other areas, they would encompass some of their gods. They had massive public ceremonies in order to stay in the gods' favor. They had festivals that were honoring gods throughout the year. Their most important god is not Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, or the sun god of the Toltecs that wanted to kill everyone, but a different sun god called something else. Huitzilopochtli, maybe? I really have no idea how to say that. But he also needed human sacrifices. There are stories of the Aztecs sacrificing literally thousands of people to the sun god in their sun god festivals. Montezuma II is the most famous emperor of the Aztecs. He becomes emperor in 1502, and he was already having to squash some of the rebellions in the outlying areas because he was asking for higher taxes. But he also is essentially the Aztec emperor responsible for the Aztec downfall. The Spanish arrive in the early 1500s, and he welcomes them into their country, and they essentially kill, ransack, and pillage the Aztecs until they disappear from the planet. So that's the Aztecs. I'm also going to go ahead and go through the Inca. The Inca is the third Mesoamerican civilization, but they emerged not in Mexico, but in the Andes Mountains. They have a huge, long-reaching empire for 1,400 years, essentially, and they make really good use of the elevations of the Andes Mountains to structure their society and to structure their agriculture. They believe that their emperor is descended from their sun god. Emperor Pachacuti conquers a lot of land, and under his empire there were 16 million people. He had 16 million citizens. I mean, this is, again, another very massive, large empire. And he's really famous for the military force, but they also begin to use diplomacy in order to convince people that they were better off being enveloped into the Incan Empire rather than fighting against them. So the government divided land similar to the way that the Persians do into smaller systems with much more centralized governments. Their national language is Quechua, which is just a native South American language. They have massive cities, including Machu Picchu, which I'm going to make a little bit bigger because you need to be able to recognize these are ruins of the city of Machu Picchu, which were built, if you notice, way up on top of the Andes Mountains. It's a very, very high in elevation city. They also had a capital, Cuzco. So if you see our little Cuzco from Emperor's New Groove, he is supposed to be an Incan emperor. The capital city, which is now this massive capital city of Cuzco, had a lot of temples and plazas and palaces and everything you would think of in a traditional large city. They structure their cities, like you can see how it's stepped, it's terraced, it's notched, similar like this. They do this structure in agriculture, and they do this structure in their building systems the same way that the ancient Chinese did this in their structures in order to deal with the geography of their environment to the best of their ability. All right. They used family groups to structure out working systems and living systems. Every society, every town, every region was divided into chunks, and that's how they kept track of everyone. They kept census for everyone. They demanded what's called mita, and your mita was where you were required to work for the state. Now, you could have been a road builder, you could have been a soldier, you could have been a mail runner. But you also could have been somebody who was responsible for caring for the elderly and caring for the disabled. Mita is just the concept that every single person in society should have a role in the government, no matter how small. Like this particular picture, you have farmers and you have people doing construction. They create a 14,000-mile road network. So we talked about the Persian road, the royal road. We talked about the Silk Road as a trade route. We talked about the Romans building roads throughout all of Europe. The Inca build roads all through the Andes for communication, for trade, and for control of their, you've got 16 million people living in your country. You've got to be able to control it militaristically some way. So there were some people whose jobs it were to go from one town to the next delivering messages. They're a very advanced society, but they're a prehistoric society. They did not develop a writing system, but they did develop a math system called the quipu. And the way that the quipu worked is, and this is what this picture on the top is an actual Inca quipu cord system, and you see that there's knots tied into it. Well, those knots meant something, and that's what this is saying. You have 1, and then you have 3, and then you have 2, and that means 132. You have 4 knots, and then 1 and 7 knots, 417. So it was a mathematical record-keeping system for a culture that didn't actually write, so they just knotted them and had to count them. We believe that they had a calendar system, but we aren't 100% sure on that. But it is something that we think that they did have inside their culture. They have less gods than the Aztecs, less gods than the Maya, but they're still a polytheistic culture. They still have a creator god and a sun god that are, again, the most important. Young women are enlisted for ceremonies, which basically meant that young women were going to be sacrificed to the gods on a regular basis. Men were trained to be priests, doing the actual ceremonies for sacrificing women. And this is one of their pyramids. I mean, basically, I think you're getting the picture that the Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, they all have pyramid structures in polytheistic religion. Cusco, the capital city, had a temple for the sun god that they completely adorned in gold. I mean, this is a very wealthy society. Unfortunately for the Inca, they suffered the same fate as the Aztecs. Their weaponry was no match for the 1500s Spanish guns and cannons and diseases, and so they have a lot of problems fighting off the Spanish. And then there are 2 brothers, Atahualpa and Huascar, and they were basically arguing over who was going to be king, and so they decided to split the empire in half. But they couldn't decide on where to split the empire in half, so then they fought a civil war. So then they were already dealing with some disease, and they were already dealing with Spanish invading, and then they're fighting amongst themselves, which eventually meant that a guy named Francisco Pizarro is going to come in and just completely destroy what's left of the Inca Empire, and it becomes completely controlled by the Spanish until countries like Peru and Bolivia and Chile get their independence in the sort of 18 and 1900s. Alright, so that's it. That's the Aztecs and the Maya. No, I'm sorry, the Aztecs and the Inca. The Maya video is separate, so if you haven't found that yet, you need to make sure you go and watch that one also.